A woman with calloused hands and hidden wisdom travels west with dreams of a new beginning, only to be rejected when her inability to read is discovered. As she struggles to find her place in a town that values what she lacks, a quiet schoolmaster sees beyond her illiteracy to the intelligence trapped within. This is a story about finding value in unexpected places, and how patience and compassion can unlock potential others never bothered to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Appalachian Mountains had never seemed more beautiful than on the day Sarah Mitchell decided to leave them forever. At 28, she stood on the worn porch of the only home she'd ever known. A tiny cabin tucked against the hillside in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky. The early spring sunshine filtered through budding trees, casting dappled shadows across the weathered planks beneath her feet. Sarah smoothed her faded calico dress with hands rough from years of work. Since her parents' passing 5 winters ago, she'd managed alone, tending the small garden, preserving what food she could, and trading her intricate hand-woven baskets and quilts with neighbors for necessities she couldn't produce herself. Her quilts were sought after throughout the county, their complex patterns and precise stitching speaking of a mathematical mind and artistic spirit that had never been given proper nurturing. Inside the cabin, propped against her mother's old Bible, was the letter that had changed everything. Sarah couldn't read a word of it herself, but Pastor Williams from the Valley Church had read it to her 3 times. The contents were burned into her memory, seeking a bride of good character and a strong constitution for life in Wyoming territory. Must be willing to work hard and help establish a prosperous homestead. Age 20 to 30 preferred. Respectable living and kind treatment guaranteed. Reply with description and references to Marcus Tillman, Pine Creek, Wyoming territory. The advertisement had appeared in a newspaper left behind by travelers passing through. When Sarah had asked Pastor Williams to read it aloud, something inside her had kindled, a longing for more than the lonely existence she faced as an unmarried woman with no family left. "You ought to think carefully on this, Sarah, Pastor Williams had warned when she'd asked him to write a reply for her. This man is a stranger. Wyoming is a wild place, nothing like these mountains. "I've got nothing keeping me here," Sarah had replied, her voice soft but determined. "And I've always been good with making something from nothing." The pastor couldn't argue with that. Sarah Mitchell might lack formal education, but no one questioned her resourcefulness or work ethic. He'd written the letter as she dictated, carefully, omitting any mention of her inability to read and write. It wasn't entirely dishonest, Sarah reasoned. She'd simply emphasized her other strengths, her cooking, sewing, quilting, and knowledge of medicinal herbs. The man had asked for someone of good character and strong constitution, not someone schooled in letters. 3 months of correspondence had followed, with Pastor Williams acting as intermediary, reading Marcus Tillman's letters to Sarah and writing her replies. Tillman had seemed pleased with what he learned of her, her industriousness, her skill with a needle, her knowledge of gardening and preserving. He'd sent train fare and a promise of marriage upon her arrival. The stage. "Leaves at noon," said Mrs. Perkins, the postmaster's wife, who had agreed to drive Sarah to the station in the family wagon. "Best finish your goodbyes to this place," Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She lifted the small wooden case that held her few possessions: 2 dresses, her mother's wedding ring, a handmade quilt, and a collection of carefully dried herbs and seeds from her garden. The seeds were her greatest treasure, heirloom varieties passed through generations of mountain women, hardy plants that could thrive in difficult soil. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. The journey west was longer and more punishing than Sarah had imagined. 4 days on crowded trains, breathing coal smoke and sleeping upright on hard wooden benches. then 2 days on a stagecoach that rattled her bones and left bruises on her hips and shoulders. By the time the coach rolled into Pine Creek, Wyoming territory, Sarah was exhausted, dusty, and fighting waves of doubt that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained courage. Pine Creek was nothing like the lush green mountains of Kentucky. The town sat on the edge of the high plains, with the distant silhouette of the Bighorn Mountains on the horizon. A single dirt street, lined with weathered buildings, stretched before her. A general store, a small church, a saloon, and several other establishments whose purposes she couldn't immediately determine. The coach rolled to a stop outside what appeared to be a hotel, though the sign hanging above the porch faded beyond legibility. Sarah gathered her belongings, heart pounding, as she prepared to meet the man who would be her husband. Miss Mitchell, and a tall man with broad shoulders and a neatly trimmed beard, approached as she stepped down from the coach. His clothes were well made, but practical, a sign of modest prosperity. "Mr. Tillman?" Sarah questioned, forcing a smile despite her exhaustion. The man nodded, studying her with keen grey eyes. "Marcus Tillman, welcome to Pine Creek." He reached for her wooden case. "Let me help you with that." "Thank you." Sarah surrendered her case, noting the strength in his hands and the careful way he handled her belongings. "You must be tired after such a journey. I've arranged a room for you at the hotel. We can discuss details over supper." Sarah followed him inside the hotel, which was plain but clean. The proprietress, Mrs. Baker, showed her to a small room on the second floor. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Baker informed her. "Mr. Tillman's arranged everything." Left alone, Sarah sank onto the narrow bed, allowing herself a moment of quiet panic. What if he discovered her secret? What if he sent her back? She had spent nearly all her savings on this journey, selling her cabin for far less than it was worth to a neighbor who knew she was desperate to leave. After washing away the worst of the travel dust and changing into her best dress, a blue, a cotton that brought out the deep color of her eyes, Sarah made her way downstairs at 6 o'clock precisely. Marcus Tillman was waiting in the small dining room, rising as she approached. "You look refreshed," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I hope the room is comfortable." "Very, thank you." Sarah took her seat, carefully observing the table setting and mimicking Tillman's movements with the napkin. Growing up in the Hollers had taught her to be observant, to learn by watching rather than by instruction. "I've ordered roast beef." "It's what they do best here," Tillman said as a server placed plates before them. "That sounds lovely." They ate in silence for a few minutes, Tillman watching her with an intensity that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. She'd expected questions about her journey, or perhaps comments about the town, but instead, he seemed to be scrutinizing her every movement. "Tell me about your education, Miss Mitchell," he said finally. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. This was the question she'd been dreading. "I was raised in the mountains," she said carefully. "My learning came mostly from my parents and from life itself." "But you did attend school," Tillman pressed. Sarah set down her fork, deciding that partial honesty was better than an outright lie. "There wasn't a proper school near our home. My mother taught me what she could." "I see." Tillman's expression hardened slightly. "In your letters, you mentioned herbal remedies and quilting patterns. You described them quite eloquently." Sarah's cheeks warmed. "Pastor Williams helped me with the letters. He has a way with words that I lack." "Pastor Williams wrote your letters," Tillman repeated, his voice flat. "He wrote as I dictated," Sarah clarified. "The thoughts were mine, though the penmanship was his." Tillman leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Can you read, Miss Mitchell?" The directness of the question left no room for evasion. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "No, Mr. Tillman, I cannot, nor can I write more than my own name." The silence that followed was deafening. Tillman's jaw worked as though he were chewing on her words, trying to decide whether to swallow them or spit them out. "This is Unexpected, he finally said. I specifically sought a bride with sufficient education to help manage my affairs. I mentioned my need for assistance with correspondence and bookkeeping in my second letter. Sarah's stomach clenched. Pastor Williams had read her that letter, but she'd assumed Tillman meant assistance in the sense of running a household, not managing written accounts. I apologize for the misunderstanding, she said, struggling to keep her voice even, but I have other skills that could be valuable to you. I can— Miss Mitchell, Tillman interrupted, I operate the town's general store. It requires extensive record-keeping, ordering of supplies, and correspondence with vendors. I need a wife who can assist with these matters, not one who requires education herself. Sarah felt as though the floor beneath her were dissolving. I learn quickly, she offered, hearing the desperation in her own voice. Learning to read and write properly takes years, not months, Tillman replied, his tone softening slightly but remaining firm. I'm not without sympathy for your situation, but this arrangement clearly won't work. What am I to do? Sarah asked, abandoning pride in the face of a practical crisis. I've come all this way. I've spent nearly everything I had. Tillman had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'll cover your room and board for 2 weeks, he said, after a moment's consideration. That should give you time to make other arrangements. Other arrangements, Sarah repeated numbly. What other arrangements could she possibly make in a strange town with no funds and no connections? Perhaps there are positions available that don't require reading, Tillman suggested, though his tone held little conviction. The hotel might need help with laundry or cooking. Sarah nodded mechanically, too stunned to argue or plead further. The remainder of the meal passed in awkward silence, both of them picking at food that had lost its appeal. When Tillman finally escorted her back to the hotel lobby, his goodbye was brief and formal. I wish you well, Miss Mitchell, he said, tipping his hat. I'll speak to Mrs. Baker about your extended stay. Alone in her room, Sarah finally allowed the tears she'd been holding back to fall. She'd risked everything on this journey, and in a single conversation, her hopes for a new life had crumbled. The small wooden case that held her possessions seemed to mock her. So little to show for 28 years of life. After her tears subsided, Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the unfamiliar landscape bathed in twilight. Pine Creek was settling into evening routines, lamps being lit in windows, a few men gathering outside the saloon, a woman hurrying along the boardwalk with a basket on her arm. Among the moving figures, one caught her attention, a tall, lean man walking with a slight limp, carrying what appeared to be a stack of books. He moved with purpose toward a small building at the end of the street that Sarah hadn't noticed earlier. As he reached the door, he paused, looking up at the sky as though checking the weather. And in that moment, the last rays of sunlight illuminated his face, younger than she'd expected, with thoughtful features and what seemed to be prematurely silver hair at his temples. Something about his solitary figure carrying books through the twilight stirred Sarah's curiosity, momentarily distracting her from her own predicament. Who was he? What was that building? Questions she couldn't ask, in a town where she now had no place. As darkness fell completely, Sarah turned from the window and prepared for bed, her mind churning with worry. Tomorrow she would need to begin looking for work. Any work that would accept a woman who couldn't read the simplest notice or sign. The prospect seemed bleak, but Sarah Mitchell had survived hardship before. The mountains had taught her persistence, if nothing else. What she didn't know, as she finally drifted into troubled sleep, was that the man with the books would soon become central to her fate in Pine Creek, and that her greatest limitation would lead her to her greatest opportunity, though not in any way she could possibly imagine. Morning arrived with harsh sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Sarah rose, washed at the small basin, and dressed in her everyday dress, a sturdy brown cotton that had seen better days but still spoke of careful mending. She braided her chestnut hair tightly and pinned it at the nape of her neck, preparing to face a day of uncertainty. In the hotel dining room, Mrs. Baker approached as Sarah sat down for breakfast, a sympathetic expression on her round face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mr. Tillman explained your situation, dear," the older woman said, placing a plate of eggs and biscuits before her. "Don't you worry too much. Pine Creek has a way of making room for those who are willing to work hard." "Thank you," Sarah said, touched by the woman's kindness. "Do you know of any work that might be available?" Mrs. Baker pursed her lips thoughtfully. "The laundry always needs help, though it's back-breaking work. Or there's the Carter place. They've got 5 young ones and Mrs. Carter's expecting." Again, she could use a helper, I'd wager. Sarah nodded, mentally noting these possibilities. Neither appealed particularly, but beggars couldn't be choosers, as her mother used to say. "Who's the man who carries books?" she asked suddenly, remembering the figure from the previous evening. "I saw him walking to a building at the end of the street." "That'd be Mr. James Harrington," Mrs. Baker replied, her expression warming. "Our schoolmaster came here 3 years ago from Boston. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's done wonders with the children. That building you saw is our schoolhouse, small, but he makes do." A schoolmaster. Sarah felt a pang of envy for the children who had what she'd been denied, the chance to learn letters and numbers properly, to unlock the mystery of books. After breakfast, Sarah set out to explore the town, hoping to find work before her 2 weeks of charity lodging expired. Pine Creek in daylight was busier than she'd expected. Wagons passing through, people moving between businesses, children darting about on unknown errands. She kept her eyes open for any sign of help needed, though she realized with frustration that such notices would likely be written ones that she couldn't decipher. The laundry, when she found it, was a steaming, noisy place that made her lungs ache just standing in the doorway. The overseer, a harried woman with red arms and a permanent scowl, told her bluntly that they'd just hired 2 girls the previous week. At the general store, Tillman's establishment, she realized with dismay, she kept her head down and her back to the counter where he might be working. Instead, she focused on the shelves, noting the variety of goods available. It was larger and better stocked than she'd expected for such a small town. "Can I help you find something, miss?" Sarah turned, relieved to see a young woman behind the counter rather than Marcus Tillman. "I'm just looking," Sarah replied, then, gathering her courage, added, "Actually, I'm new in town and looking for work. Do you know of anyone hiring?" The young woman, hardly more than 16, Sarah guessed, studied her thoughtfully. "What kind of work can you do?" "I'm good with sewing and quilting," Sarah offered. "I know herbal remedies, gardening and preserving food. I can cook and clean, tend children or animals." The girl's eyes lit up at the mention of quilting. "You're a quilter? My man loves quilts. She's been trying to find someone who can teach her proper patterns." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Are you the mail-order bride Mr. Tillman sent for? People are talking." Sarah's cheeks warmed. News traveled fast in small towns, no matter where you were. "I was," she admitted. "But there was a misunderstanding." The girl nodded sympathetically. "I'm Bessie Turner. My pa runs the livery stable. If you're good with quilting, you should talk to Mrs. Harrison at the dry goods shop. She's always looking for handmade items to sell." "Thank you, Bessie," Sarah said, grateful for the lead. "Where would I find Mrs. Harrison?" 2 doors down, the shop with the blue door. Sarah thanked her again and headed for the dry goods shop, hoping cautiously to rekindle. Perhaps her skills could provide her a living after all, even in this unfamiliar place. The shop with the blue door was a neat establishment filled with fabrics, notions, and various household goods. A bell tinkled as Sarah entered, and a woman looked up from where she was measuring fabric for a customer. "Be with you in a moment," she called. Sarah nodded and waited, taking in the colorful bolts of fabric and imagining what she might create. With them, if only she had the means to purchase materials. "Now then," the woman said, approaching after finishing with her customer. "What can I help you with today?" "Are you Mrs. Harrison?" Sarah asked. "I am." "And you are?" "Sarah Mitchell. I'm new to Pine Creek. Bessie Turner at the general store suggested I speak with you about possibly selling some of my quilts or taking in sewing work." Mrs. Harrison's eyes sharpened with interest. "You're a quilter, are you? Do you have samples of your work?" Sarah's heart sank. "Not with me. I have one quilt, but it's at the hotel. I had to leave most of my things behind when I traveled here." "And why did you come to Pine Creek, if I might ask?" Mrs. Harrison's tone was polite but probing. Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was her best approach. "I came as a mail order. Bride for Mr. Tillman, but the arrangement didn't work out." Understanding dawned in Mrs. Harrison's eyes. "Ah, I see." She studied Sarah for a moment longer, then nodded decisively. "Bring your quilt by tomorrow. If your work is as good as you claim, we might be able to arrange something." As Sarah turned to leave, the shop door opened, and the man with the books, Mr. Harrington, the schoolmaster, entered. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His limp was more pronounced as he navigated around a display of ribbons. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison," he greeted, then noticed Sarah. "Pardon me," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah felt a strange flutter of recognition, though she was certain they'd never met. Perhaps it was simply that they were both outsiders in this town, he with his Boston background and educated manner, she with her mountain ways and hidden limitations. As she slipped past him toward the door, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to understand the world of books and letters that was so natural to him, a world that remained frustratingly closed to her despite her hunger to learn. What she didn't realize, as the bell tinkled behind her, was that James Harrington was wondering something too. Who was this woman, with the intelligent eyes and the air of quiet dignity, and what had brought her to Pine Creek, Wyoming? The next morning, Sarah returned to Mrs. Harrison's shop with her quilt folded carefully in her arms. It was her finest work, a star pattern in blues and creams that she'd completed during the long winter months before deciding to leave Kentucky. She'd intended it as a wedding gift for herself and Marcus Tillman, a piece of her mountain home to bring comfort in her new life. Now it represented her only hope for independence. Mrs. Harrison's eyes widened as Sarah unfolded the quilt across the cutting table. Her fingers traced the intricate stitching, examining the perfect points where the star patterns met. "This is exceptional work," she admitted, unable to hide her surprise. "The stitches are so even, so small, and this pattern, I've never seen anything quite like it. It's an old mountain pattern," Sarah explained. "My grandmother called it Reaching Star. She said it represented how we should always reach beyond what we know." Mrs. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "I could sell this easily. The question is, what would be fair payment?" They negotiated a price that seemed generous to Sarah, though she suspected it was still below the quilt's true value. But money in hand was better than potential worth, especially in her precarious situation. "I'd be interested in more pieces like this," Mrs. Harrison added as she counted out the payment. "Perhaps we could arrange for you to create quilts specifically for the shop. I can supply the materials." Hope bloomed in Sarah's chest. "I would be grateful for such an arrangement. There's a small room behind the shop," Mrs. Harrison said, lowering her voice slightly. "My late husband used it as an office. It's not much, but it has a cot and a washstand. If you're interested in a more permanent arrangement, you could live there and work for me. Room and board, plus a small wage for each piece you complete. The offer was unexpected and almost too good to be true. Sarah studied Mrs. Harrison's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden conditions. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked finally. Mrs. Harrison's expression softened. 20 years ago, I arrived in this territory as a young widow with 2 small children and little more than the clothes on our backs. Someone showed me kindness when I needed it most." She gestured around the shop. "Now I can do the same. Besides, your work will bring customers. It's good business as well as charity." That evening, Sarah moved her few possessions from the hotel to the small room behind Mrs. Harrison's shop. The space was indeed tiny, barely enough room for the narrow cot, a small table with a basin, and a battered chest of drawers. But it had a window that looked out onto a small yard where wildflowers grow among the prairie grasses, and most importantly, it was hers. For the first time since arriving in Pine Creek, Sarah felt a tentative sense of security. She had shelter, honest, work, and the beginnings of a plan for survival. It wasn't the life she'd journeyed west to find, but it was a life she could build upon. The following days fell into a pattern. Sarah rose early, helped Mrs. Harrison open the shop, then spent her days sewing and quilting in the corner near the window where the light was best. Customers were curious about the newcomer with the skillful hands, and Mrs. Harrison proudly displayed Sarah's first quilt, which had already garnered interest from the banker's wife. "You have a gift," Mrs. Harrison told her on the 3rd day, as Sarah completed a set of intricate patchwork pillows. "Such precision without patterns or written instructions. It's remarkable." Sarah's hands stilled. "My mother said numbers and patterns lived in my head, even if letters didn't," she said quietly. "I can see how pieces should fit together before I cut them." Mrs. Harrison studied her thoughtfully. "Your illiteracy, it's not from lack of intelligence." "No, Ma'am, just lack of opportunity." Sarah resumed her stitching. "There was no school near our home, and by the time I was old enough to walk the distance to the valley school, my hands were needed at home. My father tried to teach me letters when I was small, but he had little schooling himself, and after he injured his back in the mine, he had no patience for it." "Have you ever considered learning now?" Mrs. Harrison asked. "It's never too late. You know," Sarah's needle pierced the fabric with perhaps more force than necessary. "Mr. Tillman made it clear that adults don't learn such things quickly. And who would teach me?" Before Mrs. Harrison could respond, the shop bell chimed, and several customers entered, ending their conversation. But the seed had been planted in Sarah's mind, a dangerous sprout of hope that she tried to uproot before it could take hold. That afternoon, as Sarah was sweeping the shop's porch, she noticed a small procession of children making their way down the street toward the schoolhouse. They ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 14, carrying slates and lunch pails, their voices carrying in the clear spring air. At the schoolhouse door stood Mr. Harrington, greeting each child by name as they filed inside. Sarah found herself watching longer than she intended, the broom motionless in her hands. What would it be like to walk through that door, to sit among the students, to learn what they were learning? The thought was both tantalizing and terrifying. Thinking of enrolling, the amused voice startled her. Sarah turned to find Marcus Tillman, standing a few feet away, a ledger tucked under his arm. "Mr. Tillman," she acknowledged stiffly, resuming her sweeping. "I hear Mrs. Harrison has taken you in," he continued, his tone conversational, but with an undercurrent that set Sarah's teeth on edge. "Quite the charitable woman, our Mrs. Harrison." "I work for my keep," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes on the broom, "and my quilts bring good business to her shop." "Yes, I've heard about your quilts. Quite impressive for a woman who can't read a simple pattern." There was a dismissive quality to his praise that stung more than outright criticism would have. Sarah stopped sweeping and met his eyes directly. I don't need written patterns, Mr. Tillman. I will make my own. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. Well, he said finally, it seems you've found your place after all, though it's hardly what you journeyed west expecting, is it? Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Harrison appeared in the doorway. Sarah, could you help me with this bolt of fabric? Her gaze moved to Tillman, cooling noticeably. Good afternoon, Mr. Tillman. Mrs. Harrison. He tipped his hat and continued down the street toward his store. That man, Mrs. Harrison muttered as they went inside, has all the warmth of a January blizzard. I hope he wasn't bothering you. No, Sarah said, though the encounter had left her feeling unsettled. He was just reminding me of my limitations. That evening, after closing the shop, Sarah found herself drawn toward the schoolhouse. The children were long gone, but a lamp still burned inside, visible through the single window facing the street. Without fully intending to, she found herself approaching, curious about what a schoolmaster did when school was not in session. Through the window, she could see James Harrington seated at a desk, bent over papers, a pen moving steadily across. The page. Books were stacked around him, and more lined the shelves behind. It was a scene of such peaceful intellectual activity that Sarah felt a pang of something like homesickness, though not for any home she'd ever known. As if sensing her presence, Harrington looked up suddenly, his gaze meeting hers through the window. Sarah stepped back, mortified at being caught spying, but instead of looking annoyed, the schoolmaster simply nodded in acknowledgement, then returned to his work. Sarah hurried back to Mrs. Harrison's shop, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She would need to be more careful. Pine Creek already had enough gossip about Tillman's rejected bride without adding prowler at the schoolhouse to her reputation. 2 days later, Sarah was arranging a display of handkerchiefs she'd embroidered. When the shop bell chimed, she looked up to see James Harrington entering, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Good morning," he greeted both women politely. "Mrs. Harrison, I've come about the material for our geography project." "Of course, Mr. Harrington. I set it aside for you." Mrs. Harrison disappeared into the back room, leaving Sarah and the schoolmaster in awkward silence. "You're new to Pine Creek," he said after a moment, his voice pleasant but neutral. "Miss Mitchell? Sarah Mitchell. James Harrington." He extended his hand, and Sarah hesitated only briefly before shaking it. His grip was firm but gentle, his hand smooth compared to her calloused fingers. "Have you settled in well?" Sarah nodded, wondering if he'd heard the gossip about her failed arrangement with Tillman. "Mrs. Harrison has been very kind. She's one of Pine Creek's finest citizens," he agreed. "I understand you're a quilter of considerable talent." Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Harrison returned with a large piece of muslin. "Here we are, Mr. Harrington. Enough for your map project, I believe." "Perfect, thank you." He paid for the fabric, then turned back to Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, perhaps you'd consider visiting our school sometime. The older girls are learning basic sewing techniques, and someone with your expertise could be quite inspirational." The invitation caught her completely off guard. I'm not sure I would be," she stammered. "Just a thought," he said easily, seeming to sense her discomfort. "Good day, ladies." After he left, Mrs. Harrison raised an eyebrow at Sarah. "Well, that's interesting. What do you mean? James Harrington doesn't issue casual invitations. He's particular about who influences his students." Mrs. Harrison folded a length of ribbon with precision. "He must have heard about your quilting skills. Or he's just being polite to the town's newest object of pity," Sarah said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Mrs. Harrison shook her head. "That man doesn't have a patronizing bone in his body. If he invited you to the school, it's because he genuinely thinks you have something valuable to offer." Sarah returned to her sewing, But the interaction left her unsettled. How could she possibly enter a schoolhouse, a temple of the very learning she lacked? And yet, the thought of sharing her skills with young girls was appealing. Perhaps there was a way to contribute without revealing her own deficiency. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following afternoon, a breathless young girl burst into the shop just as Sarah was helping a customer select fabric for a dress. "Mrs. Harrison, Miss Mitchell, Mr. Harrington sent it to me. There's been an accident at the school." Both women dropped what they were doing. "What happened, Lily?" Mrs. Harrison asked. "Mary Jenkins fell from the climbing tree during recess. Her arms broke badly, bone sticking out and everything. Mr. Harrington says to fetch Miss Mitchell if she's here on account of her knowing herbs and such for pain." Sarah was already reaching for her small pouch of medicinal herbs that she kept with her sewing supplies. "Did he send it to the doctor?" "Doc Wilson's gone to the Taylor Ranch for a birthing," Lily explained. "Won't be back till tomorrow." "Go!" Mrs. Harrison urged Sarah. "I'll mind the shop." Sarah hurried after Lily, her mind racing. Setting bones was something she'd done before. Her neighbor's son after a fall from an apple tree, her cousin after a wagon accident. But never with an audience of schoolchildren, and certainly not under the scrutiny of an educated man like James Harrington. The schoolhouse was in chaos when they arrived. Children crowded around a bench where a small figure lay whimpering, her face paper white with shock and pain. James Harrington knelt beside her, speaking in low, reassuring tones while keeping the other children at bay. He looked up as Sarah entered, relief washing over his features. "Miss Mitchell, thank you for coming. Mary had a bad fall." Sarah nodded, moving quickly to the girl's side. The injury was indeed serious, a compound fracture of the forearm with the bone protruding through the skin. Blood soaked the makeshift bandage Harrington had applied. "I'll need hot water, clean clothes, and 2 straight sticks for splinting," Sarah said, slipping into the calm efficiency that emergencies always brought out in her. "And the children should go outside." Harrington immediately began organizing her requests. "Thomas, run to the well. Emily, fetch the firewood kindling, the straight pieces. James Jr., take the younger children outside and keep them occupied." As the children scrambled to follow his instructions, Sarah knelt beside Mary, whose eyes were wide with terror. "I'm going to help you, Mary," she said softly. "It's going to hurt, but then it will feel better. Can you be brave for me?" The little girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Am I going to lose my arm like old Jake lost his leg in the mine?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "Your arm will heal. You're young and strong." While waiting for the hot water, Sarah prepared a willow bark infusion for pain from her herb pouch, mixing it with a small amount of honey she'd brought along. "Drink this," she instructed Mary. "It will help with the pain." Harrington watched with interest as she worked. "You seem experienced with injuries." "Mountain life has its hazards," Sarah replied simply, "and no doctors within a day's ride." When the hot water arrived, Sarah cleaned the wound carefully, then looked up at Harrington. "I need to set the bone. You'll need to hold her still. This will be painful, despite the willow bark." His eyes met hers, steady and trusting. "Tell me what to do." With Harrington holding Mary securely, Sarah took a deep breath and snapped the bone back into alignment with one swift, precise movement. Mary's scream was heart-wrenching but brief. She fainted immediately, which was a mercy. Working quickly, Sarah cleaned the wound again, applied a poultice of herbs to prevent festering, and bound the arm between 2 smooth sticks with strips of clean cloth, creating a solid splint. "That was, remarkable," Harrington said quietly as they finished. "Where did you learn such skills?" "My grandmother was a healer," Sarah explained, wiping her bloodied hands on a damp cloth. "She taught. My mother, who taught me. Mountain folk have always tended their own." Mary began to stir, whimpering as consciousness brought pain. Sarah mixed another weaker dose of willow bark. "This will help her sleep," The bone was set clean. Children heal quickly if infection doesn't set in. Harrington dismissed the school for the remainder of the day, sending a boy to fetch Mary's mother. As they waited, he studied Sarah with new eyes. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect, Mr. Harrington?" Sarah asked, suddenly tired of being assessed, and found wanting or surprising by the townspeople. "I don't know," he admitted. "The rumors said you were Tillman's mail-order bride, rejected for some unspecified inadequacy. I'm beginning to think the inadequacy was his, not yours." The unexpected support warmed Sarah, but she wasn't ready to reveal her secret shame to this educated man. "Kind of you to say, but Mr. Tillman had reasonable expectations that I couldn't meet." Before Harrington could probe further, Mary's mother arrived in a panic, which quickly transformed to gratitude when she saw her daughter resting comfortably with a properly set arm. "You're a godsend, Miss Mitchell," Mrs. Jenkins declared. "Doc, Wilson would have taken twice as long and charged twice as much, and Mary wouldn't be resting so peaceful-like." After Mrs. Jenkins had taken Mary home with clear instructions for her care, Sarah prepared to return to the shop. But James Harrington stopped her at the door. "Miss Mitchell, I owe you my thanks. You handled a crisis that would have overwhelmed many." Sarah shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "Anyone with the knowledge would have done the same." "That's just it. Not everyone has such knowledge." He hesitated, then forged ahead. "I'd like to propose an exchange." "Exchange?" Sarah echoed, puzzled. "Your knowledge for mine." Seeing her confusion, he elaborated. "You could teach my older students about herbal remedies and basic medical care, knowledge that's invaluable on the frontier. And in return—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In return, I could teach you whatever you wish to learn." The offer hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Somehow James Harrington had discerned her secret, or at least suspected it, and was offering her a chance to overcome it without public humiliation. "Why would you do that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His expression was earnest, without a trace of condescension. "Because education isn't just for children, Miss Mitchell. And because a mind that can calculate complex quilt patterns without written instructions and set a broken bone with such precision shouldn't be limited by circumstances of birth or opportunity." Sarah stood frozen, hope and fear warring within her. To learn to read, to unlock the world of books and knowledge that had always been closed to her. It was everything she'd secretly longed for. But to admit her deficiency to this learned man, to make herself vulnerable to potential ridicule or disappointment— "I need to think about it," she said finally. Harrington nodded, respecting her reticence. "Of course. The offer stands whenever you're ready." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small book, holding it out to her. "In the meantime, perhaps you'd like to look at this. It's a guide to medicinal plants of the Western Territories. The illustrations are quite detailed." Sarah accepted the book hesitantly, her fingers tracing the embossed title she couldn't read. "Thank you." As she walked back to Mrs. Harrison's shop, the small book felt heavy in her pocket, a weight of possibility, a burden of decision. James Harrington had offered her a key to a locked door. The question was whether she had the courage to use it. What Sarah couldn't know was that James Harrington watched her departure with his own tumultuous thoughts. The woman who had just saved one of his students from potential crippling had depths he hadn't anticipated. She moved through the world with quiet competence, despite what he now suspected was a significant limitation. There was something about her that called to him, a kindred spirit perhaps, someone who valued knowledge and healing as he did, though their paths to such values had been vastly different. Later that evening, as Harrington sat at his desk in the small cabin he called home, he found himself composing a letter, not to Sarah Mitchell, who wouldn't be able to read it, but to himself, articulating thoughts he barely understood. Words about courage and resilience, about the arbitrary nature of education, and about the particular quality of light in a woman's eyes when she performed work she knew to be valuable. He folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, uncertain. Why he'd written it or what he intended to do with it. All he knew was that something had shifted in Pine Creek with the arrival of Sarah Mitchell, and he found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. For 3 days, Sarah carried the small book of medicinal plants in her pocket, its presence a constant reminder of James Harrington's offer. During quiet moments at the shop, she would remove it and study the illustrations, recognizing many of the plants she'd used all her life, though she couldn't decipher their printed names. "You're wearing a path in the floorboards with your pacing," Mrs. Harrison commented on the 4th evening as Sarah moved restlessly around her small room. "Is something troubling you?" Sarah hesitated, then produced the book. "Mr. Harrington gave me this, and he offered to teach me to read." Mrs. Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Well now, that's generous of him. He wants me to teach his students about herbal medicine in exchange," Sarah explained, "but I'm not sure I should accept." "Why ever not?" Mrs. Harrison looked genuinely puzzled. "It seems like a fair arrangement." Sarah stared down at the book in her hands. "What if I can't learn? What if I'm too old or too slow? Mr. Harrington will have wasted his time, and I'll have proven Mr. Tillman right." Mrs. Harrison settled into the room's single chair, regarding Sarah thoughtfully. "When I first opened this shop after my husband died, I knew nothing about running a business. The numbers confused me, the ordering was complicated, and I was certain I would fail." She smoothed her apron. "But I learned, one day at a time, because I had to. Not because it was easy, but because the alternative was worse." "This is different," Sarah protested. "Learning to read as an adult is difficult, yes, but not impossible." Mrs. Harrison's voice was firm. "And James Harrington is possibly the most patient teacher in the Wyoming Territory. If anyone can help you, it's him." Sarah ran her fingers over the book's leather cover. "I'm afraid," she admitted softly. "Of course you are. Learning anything new is frightening. But ask yourself this, which will you regret more? Trying and possibly failing, or never trying at all?" The question lingered in Sarah's mind as she fell into restless sleep that night. By morning, she had made her decision. The schoolhouse was quiet when Sarah approached it after the shop closed the following day. School had ended hours earlier, but as she'd hoped, a lamp still burned inside. She hesitated at the door, nearly losing her nerve, before finally knocking. James Harrington opened it moments later, surprise registering on his face before he composed himself. "Miss Mitchell, good evening." "I've been thinking about your offer," Sarah said, without preamble. "I'd like to accept if it still stands." A smile spread across his face, transforming his serious features. "It absolutely stands. Please, come in." The schoolhouse was a single room with rows of benches facing a larger desk at the front. A blackboard covered one wall, and bookshelves lined another. It smelled of chalk dust, ink, and the particular scent of well-used books. "I was just finishing some grading," Harrington explained, clearing papers from a small table near his desk. "Would you like to sit?" Sarah perched on the edge of a bench, suddenly acutely aware of her surroundings. She'd never been inside a proper schoolhouse before. "Before we begin," she said, needing to establish boundaries, "I should be clear about my situation. I can recognize a few letters and write my name, but that's all. My numbers are somewhat better. I can count and do basic sums in my head. But reading and writing—" She trailed off, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Harrington nodded, showing no surprise or judgment. "Thank you for your honesty. We'll start with the basics and progress at whatever pace suits you." He sat across from her. "And when would you like to begin teaching my students about herbal remedies?" "Whenever you think appropriate," Sarah replied, relieved that he hadn't commented on her limitations, "though I'm not sure what I could offer that would be valuable enough to exchange for reading lessons." "Don't underestimate your knowledge. Miss Mitchell, after witnessing your skill with Mary Jenkins, I'd say you have plenty to teach." Harrington rose and selected a slate and chalk from his desk. "Now, shall we begin with the alphabet?" The next hour passed more quickly than Sarah could have imagined. Harrington was indeed a patient teacher, neither condescending nor rushing. He started with vowel sounds, connecting them to words Sarah already knew. "A as in apple," he explained, writing the letter on the slate. "E as in egg. I was in ink." To Sarah's surprise, the letters began to make sense when associated with familiar objects. By the end of the hour, she could recognize all 5 vowels and was beginning to understand how they formed the foundation of words. "You're a natural student," Harrington commented as she successfully identified each vowel in a sequence. "Your mind grasps patterns quickly." "Patterns I understand," Sarah agreed. "It's like quilting, seeing how pieces fit together to create something whole." Harrington's eyes lit with interest. "That's exactly right. Reading is recognizing patterns in letters, just as you recognize patterns in fabric." He checked his pocket watch. "We should probably conclude for tonight, but perhaps we could continue tomorrow. Same time." Sarah nodded, surprised at her own eagerness for the next lesson. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Your patience is appreciated." "James," he said unexpectedly, "if we're to be colleagues of sorts, teaching each other, perhaps we could use first names, at least during these sessions." The suggestion startled her, but Sarah found herself nodding. "Very well, James." His name felt foreign on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her both uncomfortable and inexplicably pleased. As they arranged to meet the following evening, neither noticed Marcus Tillman watching from across the street, his expression darkening as he observed their friendly parting. Over the next 2 weeks, a new routine emerged. Sarah worked at the dry goods shop during the day, creating quilts and garments that increasingly attracted customers from neighboring settlements. In the evenings, 3 times a week, she met James at the schoolhouse for reading lessons. His teaching methods were innovative and tailored to her specific needs. Recognizing her affinity for patterns, he developed exercises that transformed letters into visual designs. For numbers, he connected them to quilt dimensions and fabric measurements, concepts Sarah already understood intuitively. On Thursdays, Sarah visited the school during the afternoon to teach the older students about medicinal plants. She brought samples from her collection, showing them how to identify beneficial herbs and prepare simple remedies for common ailments. "Miss Mitchell, how'd you learn all this if you couldn't read books about it?" asked Abigail Turner, one of the more precocious 12-year-olds, during the second lesson. The question sent a ripple of discomfort through Sarah, but James intervened smoothly. "Miss Mitchell learned through the oldest and perhaps most reliable method of education, direct apprenticeship and observation. Before books were common, this was how all knowledge was preserved and passed on." His explanation satisfied the children while preserving Sarah's dignity, and she shot him a grateful glance. As May bloomed into June, Sarah's progress with reading accelerated. She mastered the alphabet, began recognizing simple words, and even attempted writing short sentences. The world of letters was gradually opening to her, revealing possibilities she'd never imagined. "You're advancing more quickly than any student I've taught," James told her one evening, as she successfully read a full paragraph from a simple reader. "Your determination is remarkable." "I have an excellent teacher," Sarah replied, the compliment coming more easily than it would have weeks earlier. Their initial formality had mellowed into a comfortable companionship based on mutual respect, And I have an excellent student, he countered with a smile, one who sees connections that often escape others. The warmth in his voice made Sarah glance up, catching an expression in his eyes that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. She looked away quickly, focusing on the book before her. "I should probably return to Mrs. Harrison's," she said, rising. "It's getting late." James nodded, the moment passing. "Of course, though before you go I have something for you." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small leather-bound journal. "I thought you might like to practice your writing between our lessons." Sarah accepted the gift, running her fingers over the blank pages. "It's beautiful. Thank you. I noticed your quilt patterns are all stored in your memory," he explained. "Perhaps having them written down would be useful, and you could record your herbal remedies as well." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. No one had ever so perfectly understood both her limitations and her potential at the same time. "I'll treasure it," she said simply. As summer approaches, Pine Creek hums with activity. Ranchers prepared for cattle drives, merchants stocked up for increased trade, and the community planned its annual Independence Day celebration. Sarah found herself unexpectedly integrated into town life, her quilts now displayed prominently in Mrs. Harrison's shop window, her herbal remedies sought after by families who had witnessed their effectiveness with the Jenkins girl. Even Marcus. Tillman's initial coldness had thawed slightly. He nodded politely when they passed on the street and occasionally stopped at the shop to purchase items, though he carefully avoided being served by Sarah. "You've become quite the town fixture," Mrs. Harrison observed one afternoon as they watched a customer depart with one of Sarah's quilted wall hangings. A far cry from the uncertain young woman who arrived this spring. Sarah smiled, acknowledging the truth in this. "Pine Creek has been kinder than I expected." "Some more than others," Mrs. Harrison remarked with a knowing glance. "James Harrington seems particularly attentive to your comfort." Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks. "He's been kind enough to teach me reading, nothing more." Mrs. Harrison raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. "Speaking of reading, how is your progress?" "Better than I ever imagined," Sarah admitted. "I can read simple texts now and write basic sentences. James says, Mr. Harrington says I have a natural affinity for language once the initial barriers are overcome." "Remarkable," Mrs. Harrison murmured. "And do you enjoy learning?" "More than I can express," Sarah replied, her voice softening. "It's like having a door unlocked after a lifetime of standing outside, peering through windows." The bell above the shop door jingled, interrupting their conversation. To Sarah's surprise, James entered, looking somewhat harried. "Miss Mitchell." "Mrs. Harrison," he greeted them. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have a situation that requires Miss Mitchell's expertise if you can spare her." "Of course," Mrs. Harrison replied. "What's happened?" "Thomas Wilson, the blacksmith's son, was kicked by a horse this morning. Doc Wilson is treating the broken leg, but the boy developed a fever that's worsening by the hour. The doctor's remedies haven't helped." James looked directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Wilson remembered your treatment of Mary Jenkins and asked if you might have something for the fever." Sarah was already moving toward her small store of herbs kept in the back room. "Willow bark for the pain and fever, but if it's rising quickly he may need elderberries and echinacea as well. I'll need to see him to be certain." Within minutes, she had gathered her supplies and was following James toward the blacksmith's home at the edge of town. The normal professional distance between them evaporated in the urgency of the moment. "How high is the fever?" Sarah asked. As they hurried along, "High enough that he's delirious. The doctor fears brain inflammation." Sarah frowned. "That's concerning. How old is Thomas?" 11. Strong boy usually, but the injury was severe. They arrived at a modest house behind, the blacksmith's shop, where anxious family members greeted them with visible relief. Mrs. Wilson, a stout woman with tear-streaked cheeks, immediately led Sarah to her son's bedside. Thomas lay thrashing weakly on sweat-soaked sheets, his face flushed crimson. One leg splintered and bandaged. Doc Wilson, a grey-haired man with a perpetually grim expression, stood nearby, arms crossed. "Miss Mitchell," he acknowledged curtly, "I've administered quinine and applied cold compresses with little effect." Sarah nodded, respecting his territory, while assessing the situation with her own eyes. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the boy. The doctor stepped aside with obvious reluctance. Sarah placed her palm on Thomas's forehead, feeling the alarming heat radiating from his skin. "How long has the fever been this high?" she asked. "Started rising about 4 hours after the injury," Mrs. Wilson supplied. "Got really bad in the last hour." Sarah examined the splintered leg carefully, noting the swelling and redness extending beyond the bandages. "The fever's coming from the wound," she said. "There's an infection setting in." Doc Wilson stiffened. "I cleaned it thoroughly." "I'm sure you did," Sarah replied diplomatically, "but horse hooves can drive dirt deep into the tissues." She turned to Mrs. Wilson. "I need hot water, clean clothes, and a basin. Also honey if you have it." As Mrs. Wilson hurried to gather the requested items, Sarah unpacked her herbs. "The splint will need to be removed temporarily," she told the doctor. He bristled. "The bone needs to remain immobilized." "The infection will kill him before the bone can heal," Sarah countered, her voice calm but firm. "We need to draw out the poison." James, who had been observing quietly from the doorway, spoke up. "Doc, I've seen Miss Mitchell's methods work with similar inflammations. Perhaps we could try her approach?" The doctor's resistance wavered in the face of the boy's obvious deterioration and the parents' pleading eyes. "Very well, but I'll assist with removing and replacing the splint." Working together in an uneasy alliance, Sarah and Doc Wilson removed the splinting. As Sarah had suspected, the wound beneath was angry and inflamed, with a pocket of infection forming along the break. "It needs to drain," she murmured, reaching for her small knife. The doctor looked alarmed. "You're going to launch it?" "The pressure needs to be released," Sarah explained. "I'll make a small incision, drain the wound, then apply a poultice to draw out remaining infection and reduce the inflammation." After a moment's hesitation, Doc Wilson nodded. "Proceed." With steady hands, Sarah made a precise cut where the infection was most concentrated. Purulent fluid drained immediately, bringing visible relief to the swelling. She cleaned the area thoroughly, then prepared a poultice of echinacea, honey and other herbs whose properties combated infection and reduced inflammation. "This should stay in place for at least 4 hours, she instructed as she applied the mixture to the wound. "Then it should be replaced with a fresh one. I'll leave enough herbs for 3 applications." While Sarah worked, James had prepared a willow bark and elderberry tea. "For the fever and to strengthen his blood against the infection," he explained, surprising Sarah with his knowledge. "You've been paying attention during my lessons," she observed with a small smile. "I always pay attention to valuable knowledge," he replied, their eyes meeting briefly in shared understanding. After the poultice was applied and the leg carefully resplinted, Sarah provided detailed instructions to Mrs. Wilson for continuing the treatment. "The fever should begin to subside within a few hours. If it doesn't or if it worsens, send it to me immediately." Doc Wilson had observed her methods with increasing interest. As they prepared to leave, he approached Sarah. "Where did you learn these techniques? They're unorthodox, but effective." "From my grandmother, who learned from her mother before her," Sarah replied. "Mountain medicine relies on what's available when doctors aren't." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "I'd be interested in learning more about these herbal applications, Miss Mitchell. Perhaps we could discuss them sometime." His professional acknowledgement meant more to Sarah than he could know. "I'd be happy to share what I know, Doctor." They walked back toward town in the gathering dusk. James was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. "You were remarkable back there, Sarah. You stood your ground with a trained physician and quite possibly saved that boy's life." The praise warmed her, but she deflected it modestly. Doc Wilson had done everything his training taught him. Sometimes, different perspectives are needed, that's all. "That's precisely it," James said, stopping to face her. "Your different perspective is valuable, essential even to this community. Yet just months ago, you were ready to believe your illiteracy made you worthless." Sarah looked away, uncomfortable with both the criticism and the underlying praise. "I was wrong," she admitted softly. "As was Tillman," James added, his voice taking on an edge she rarely heard from him. "His rejection was the best thing that could have happened to you, and to Pine Creek." The mention of Tillman brought Sarah back to reality. "It's getting late. Mrs. Harrison will worry." James nodded, accepting the change of subject. "Of course, though—" He hesitated, then forged ahead. "I've been meaning to ask if you would consider attending the Independence Day celebration with me, as friends," he added quickly. "Many of my students will be performing readings and recitations. I thought you might enjoy seeing the practical application of what you've been learning." The invitation startled Sarah. Public events were one thing, but attending as someone's companion, even as friends, was another entirely. Yet she found herself nodding. "I'd like that. Thank you." The smile that lit his face reminded her of sunshine breaking through clouds. "Excellent. It's still 2 weeks away, so we have plenty of time to prepare." As they continued walking, Sarah was acutely aware of a shift in their relationship. The professional exchange of knowledge had developed into something warmer, something with currents of possibility running beneath the surface. What neither of them noticed was Marcus Tillman watching from the shadows of his store porch, his expression hardening as he observed their companionable return from the blacksmith's home. The rejected mail-order bride and the educated schoolmaster. It was an alliance that troubled him for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, even to himself. Later that night, Sarah sat in her small room, the oil lamp burning low as she opened the journal James had given her. With careful concentration, she wrote her first independent sentence. "Today, I helped save Thomas Wilson." The letters were uneven, childlike in their formation, but they were hers, words she had created, thoughts she had captured on paper. On the next page, she began recording her herbal remedies, starting with the fever poultice she'd used on Thomas. The process was painstaking and imperfect, but with each word she wrote, Sarah felt the power of preservation. Her knowledge would no longer die with her. It could be shared, passed on, multiplied. In his own small cabin on the outskirts of town, James Harrington sat at his desk, a blank sheet of paper before him. He dipped his pen and began writing, not lesson plans or school records, but a letter he had no intention of sending. "Dear Sarah, today I watched you fight for a child's life, with nothing but knowledge, herbs, and quiet determination. You stood before a trained physician and held your ground, not from arrogance, but from certainty in what you knew to be true. This is courage of a kind I've rarely witnessed. When you first entered my schoolhouse, I saw someone hungry for knowledge, but afraid to claim it. Now I see a woman growing into her power with each passing day. Your mind is a marvel, connecting patterns, solving problems, preserving wisdom that books often overlook. I find myself thinking of you at odd moments, wondering what you would make of a passage in a book I'm reading, or how you might solve a problem facing the school. These thoughts come unbidden but not unwelcome. I tell myself our connection is that of teacher and student, of colleagues with shared interests. But in moments of honesty, I must acknowledge it may be becoming something more." James stopped writing, considered the words on the page, then carefully folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box with others he had written. Private thoughts never meant to be shared. Or at least, not yet. What neither Sarah nor James could know was that forces were already in motion that would test their growing bond, and that the Independence Day celebration would bring more than patriotic speeches and children's recitations. To Pine Creek. News of Thomas Wilson's recovery spread quickly through Pine Creek. The blacksmith's son, who many feared might lose his leg or even his life to infection, was up and moving with crutches just a week after Sarah's intervention. Doc Wilson, rather than resenting her contribution, had begun incorporating her herbal treatments into his own practice, even sending patients to her for certain ailments. "Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism is acting up something fierce," he told Sarah. One afternoon, stopping by the dry goods shop, "that willow and meadowsweet salve you made for Thomas's mother worked wonders for her joints. Think you could prepare something similar?" Sarah nodded, pleased by the doctor's professional recognition. "I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning. Should I bring it to your office or directly to Mrs. Peterson?" "My office, if you don't mind. And perhaps you could write down the recipe?" The doctor's eyes twinkled. "Harrington tells me your writing is coming along nicely." A blush warmed Sarah's cheeks. "I'm still learning, but I'd be happy to share the recipe." After the doctor left, Mrs. Harrison gave a low whistle. "Well now, from rejected bride to respected healer in just 3 months. You've come a long way, Sarah Mitchell. Thanks to your kindness and Mr. Harrington's teaching," Sarah replied, returning to the dress she was altering for the mayor's wife. "Speaking of James," Mrs. Harrison said casually, "there's been talk about you two." Sarah's needle stilled. "What kind of talk?" "The usual. Small towns run on gossip, you know that. Some say he's sweet on you. Others say you're just his charity project." Mrs. Harrison shrugged. "People will always talk. Question is, does it bother you?" Sarah considered this. "It bothers me that they would reduce Mr. Harrington's kindness to either romance or charity. He's a teacher. Teaching is what he does, regardless of the student's age or circumstances. And that's all it is?" Mrs. Harrison pressed gently. "Just teaching?" The question hung in the air, demanding an honesty Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to face. Her relationship with James had evolved over the past months, blurring the lines between teacher and student, between colleagues and something more intimate. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "And even if it were more, I'm not sure it would be wise." "Because of your different backgrounds?" Mrs. Harrison asked. "Because of everything," Sarah replied, resuming her stitching with perhaps more force than necessary. "He's educated, respected. I'm just beginning to read at a child's level. He has position and standing. I work in your back room and mix herbs." Mrs. Harrison shook her head. "You're looking at it all wrong. James values knowledge, all kinds of knowledge, not just what's found in books. And you possess wisdom many educated folks lack." She reached over and patted Sarah's hand. "Besides, I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. That's not the look of a teacher for a student." Before Sarah could respond, the shop bell jingled. Both women looked up to see Marcus Tillman entering, his usual stern expression firmly in place. "Mrs. Harrison, Miss Mitchell," he greeted them with a curt nod. "I need fabric for curtains. My housekeeper insists the afternoon sun is fading the parlor furniture." Mrs. Harrison moved to assist him, leaving Sarah to her sewing. But Tillman seemed distracted, his gaze drifting repeatedly toward Sarah. "I understand you've been treating illnesses around town," he said abruptly. "Thomas Wilson's leg, Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism." Sarah looked up, surprised by the direct address. "Simple remedies, nothing more. And yet effective, according to reports." He fingered a bolt of heavy cotton. "You've found your place here more quickly than I anticipated." There was something in his tone that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Not quite resentment, not quite admiration, but a strange mixture of both. "Pine Creek has been welcoming," she replied neutrally. "Indeed." Tillman's mouth tightened. "Particularly our schoolmaster. I understand you've been taking reading lessons." The personal nature of the inquiry caught Sarah off guard. "Mr. Harrington, Has been generous with his time, yes. Quite generous, Tillman agreed, his emphasis making the words sound like criticism. Though one wonders about his motives. Mrs. Harrison intervened smoothly. Mr. Tillman, I think this blue would suit your parlor beautifully. It won't fade as quickly as darker colors. The conversation turned to curtain fabric, much to Sarah's relief. But Tillman's comments lingered in her mind long after he'd made his purchase and departed. That evening, as Sarah prepared for her reading lesson with James, she found herself unusually preoccupied with her appearance. She changed from her work dress to a blue calico she'd recently completed, brushed her hair until it shone, and even pinched her cheeks for color. This is foolishness, she muttered to her reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin. It's just a reading lesson. But Mrs. Harrison's words echoed in her mind. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. The schoolhouse was quiet when she arrived, the last red-gold rays of the summer sun slanting through its western windows. James was at his desk, but rose immediately when she entered. Sarah, he greeted her, and she couldn't help noticing how naturally her given name now sounded on his lips. You look lovely this evening. Thank you, she replied, suddenly shy. It's a new dress. I finished it yesterday. Your sewing skills rival your quilting, he observed, pulling out a chair for her at the small table they used for lessons. I've bought something special for tonight's lesson. From his desk, James retrieved a slim volume bound in worn leather. This was my first book of poetry, given to me by my mother when I was 12. I thought we might try reading a few simpler selections together. Poetry. Sarah's heart quickened with both anticipation and apprehension. She'd progressed to reading, simple texts and writing basic sentences, but poetry seemed a giant leap forward. Are you sure I'm ready for that? She asked doubtfully. Absolutely, James assured her. Poetry often uses straightforward language to express complex ideas, and these particular poems have strong rhythms that make them easier to read aloud. He opened the book to a marked page. Shall we try? The poem he'd selected was indeed simple in its language, a lyrical description of sunrise over mountains that reminded Sarah poignantly of her Kentucky home. With James's gentle guidance, she worked through it line by line, stumbling occasionally, but capturing the rhythm more easily than she'd expected. Trees against the morning sky, gold and crimson banners fly, she read, the imagery vivid in her mind. Day awakens with a sigh, night's shadows slowly die. Beautiful, James murmured when she finished. You read that with perfect feeling. Sarah flushed with pleasure. The words painted pictures I could see. That's exactly what poetry should do. His smile was warm with approval. You have a natural ear for language, Sarah. Once the technical aspects of reading are mastered, your innate understanding of meaning and rhythm emerges. They continued through several more poems, James occasionally reading one aloud to demonstrate different rhythms and tones. Sarah found herself mesmerized by his voice, the way it caressed certain words and strengthened others. Would you read one more? She asked when he prepared to close the book. I like listening to you. Something flickered in James's eyes, a momentary intensity that made Sarah's breath catch. He nodded, turning to a different section of the book. This one has always been a favorite, he said softly, and began to read. The poem was unlike the others, not about nature or abstract concepts, but about love, about seeing beyond surface appearances to the true worth within a person, about finding unexpected beauty in overlooked places. James's voice grew quieter as he read, more intimate, his eyes rarely leaving the page to meet Sarah's. When he finished, a silence fell between them, charged with unspoken meaning. That was... Sarah searched for words. That felt personal. Poetry often does, James replied. The best poems speak directly to our experiences, even when written by someone who lived centuries before us. He closed the book, but didn't immediately put it away. "I have something to ask you, Sarah. The Independence Day celebration is the day after tomorrow, and I know we've already arranged to attend together. But there's to be a dance afterward, and I wondered if you might consider staying for that as well, with me." The invitation was unmistakably different from their previous arrangement to attend the festivities as friends. A dance was public, intentional, a declaration of sorts. "People will talk," Sarah said, echoing Mrs. Harrison's earlier warning. "People already talk," James countered gently. "The question is whether we let their talk determine our choices." Sarah thought of Tillman's pointed comments about James's motives, of the whispers that had followed her since her arrival in Pine Creek, of the boundaries she'd spent her life navigating. "I'd like to attend the dance with you," she said finally. "But I should warn you, I've never had formal dance lessons." James's face brightened with genuine delight. "Fortunately, dancing is one area where I can claim some proficiency. We mountain folk aren't completely without social graces." His playful reference to his own Appalachian origins, something he rarely mentioned, made Sarah laugh. "Well then, Professor Harrington, I accept your invitation." Independence Day dawned clear and hot, the kind of crystalline summer day that seemed to stretch endlessly before surrendering to twilight. Pine Creek was transformed by red, white, and blue bunting draped across storefronts, American flags flying from every available pole, and a general air of festivity that infected even the most sober citizens. The celebration was to be held in the town square, where a platform had been erected for speeches and performances. Afterward, the schoolhouse would host the dance, its interior transformed by the Women's Auxiliary Committee. Sarah spent the morning helping Mrs. Harrison prepare for the shop's participation in the festivities. They would have a stall displaying Sarah's quilts and needlework, alongside special holiday ribbons and fabric bundles. "You're as nervous as a cat in a rocking chair factory," Mrs. Harrison observed, as Sarah rearranged the same quilt display. "For the third time. Anyone would think you were giving the keynote address instead of just attending with the schoolmaster." "Is it that obvious?" Sarah asked, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from the quilt. "Only to someone who knows you well," Mrs. Harrison assured her, "which I'm pleased to say I do after these months." She studied Sarah with motherly concern. "Are you worried about dancing, or about being seen publicly with James?" "Both. Neither." Sarah sighed, trying to articulate her jumbled feelings. "I'm more worried about disappointing him, I think, about embarrassing him in front of the whole town." Mrs. Harrison's expression softened. "Oh, my dear, James Harrington knew exactly who you were when he invited you to be his partner for this celebration. He's not a man who makes decisions lightly or without consideration of consequences." "But that's just it," Sarah insisted. "He's always so thoughtful, so careful about doing the right thing. What if his invitation was motivated by kindness rather than anything deeper?" "Then you'll enjoy a pleasant evening with a friend who values your company," Mrs. Harrison replied practically. "But I suspect there's more to it than simple kindness." She checked the clock on the wall. "Now, you'd better get ready. The speeches start at 2. And you'll want time to change into your new dress." The dress in question was Sarah's finest creation yet, a summer-weight cotton in a deep blue that brought out her eyes, with white lace trim she'd painstakingly attached by hand. It was modestly cut, but more fitted than her usual attire, accentuating her slender waist and graceful neck. When she emerged from her room in the completed outfit, Mrs. Harrison clasped her hands in approval. "Perfect. James won't be able to take his eyes off you." Sarah blushed, but couldn't deny the little thrill of anticipation that ran through her at the thought. The town square was already crowded when they arrived to set up their stall. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children darted about with small flags and pinwheels, and the smell of barbecue and lemonade filled the air. On the platform, Town dignitaries arranged themselves according to some unwritten hierarchy, with Mayor Thompson at the center. Sarah spotted James immediately. He stood near the schoolchildren, who were lined up in neat rows awaiting their turn to perform recitations. In his Sunday best, a crisp white shirt, dark vest and perfectly pressed trousers, he cut a striking figure. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, eyes scanning the crowd, until they found her. The smile that spread across his face made Sarah's heart flutter embarrassingly. He excused himself from his students and made his way toward her. "You look beautiful," he said simply when he reached her, taking in her new dress with obvious appreciation. "Thank you," Sarah replied, equally aware of how handsome he appeared. "Your students seem well prepared." "They've been practicing for weeks," James confirmed, "though they're more excited about the ice cream afterward than the actual performance." They shared a laugh, the momentary tension dissolving into easy companionship. James helped Sarah and Mrs. Harrison finish setting up their display, then offered his arm. "Shall we find seats for the speeches? I've saved places near the front for us." The formality of the gesture, being publicly escorted by James before the entire town, was not lost on Sarah. She was acutely aware of the glances and whispers that followed them as they made their way to the seating area. Some were approving, others curious, and a few, notably from a group that included Marcus, Tillman distinctly disapproving. "Everyone's watching," she murmured, her hand tightening on James's arm. "Let them," he replied calmly. "We're doing nothing wrong or improper." The afternoon progressed with the predictable rhythm of small-town patriotic celebrations, lengthy speeches from local officials, recitations of the Declaration of Independence, patriotic songs led by the church choir. Sarah found herself genuinely moved by the children's performances, particularly when they recited poetry James had taught them. "They're wonderful," she whispered to him after a particularly heartfelt rendition of "America the Beautiful" by the older students. "You've taught them well." James squeezed her hand briefly, his eyes reflecting both pride in his students and pleasure at her compliment. The casual intimacy of the gesture, performed without self-consciousness before the assembled townspeople, marked another subtle shift in their relationship. As the formal program concluded and people dispersed to enjoy the food and games before the evening dance, Sarah found herself approached by an unexpected visitor, Doc Wilson's wife, a genteel woman who rarely ventured beyond her social circle of town matrons. "Miss Mitchell," Mrs. Wilson greeted her with a nod that managed to be both polite and assessing. "My husband speaks highly of your herbal knowledge. I understand you've been assisting him with several patients. Dr. Wilson has been kind enough to value my small contributions," Sarah replied cautiously, aware of James standing protectively at her side. "Not small at all, according to him," Mrs. Wilson countered. "He says your poultice saved Thomas Jenkins's leg when traditional methods failed." She hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. "Our Ladies' Aid Society meets Thursday afternoons at the church. We focus on charitable works and community improvement. Your perspective might be valuable if you're interested in attending." The invitation, clearly representing acceptance from a quarter of Pine Creek society that had previously ignored Sarah's existence, caught her completely off guard. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I'd be honored." The older woman nodded, satisfied. "Excellent. 2 o'clock. We're discussing improvements to the town's medical supplies." With a polite nod to James, she moved on to join her husband. "Well," James said when she had gone, barely concealing a smile, "it seems you've been officially welcomed into Pine Creek society." "I'm as surprised as you are," Sarah admitted. 3 months ago, they wouldn't have acknowledged me on the street." 3 months ago, they didn't know your worth," James replied. "You've proven it to them through actions, not words." As they strolled through the festive crowd, sampling food and watching children's games, Sarah was struck by how differently she was treated compared to her first days in town. People greeted her by name, asked about remedies for minor ailments, and complimented her needlework displayed at Mrs. Harrison's stall. She was no longer Tillman's rejected bride, but Miss Mitchell the healer, or Miss Mitchell who makes those fine quilts. And increasingly, she was identified by her association with James Harrington, a connection that seemed to confer its own kind of legitimacy in the eyes of the community. When evening approached and people began drifting toward the schoolhouse for the dance, Sarah felt a renewed wave of nervousness. Dancing was a social skill she'd never had the opportunity to learn in her isolated mountain home. The few community gatherings she'd attended had featured traditional reels and square dances, not the more formal waltzes she expected at tonight's event. "We don't have to stay for the entire dance," James reassured her, sensing her anxiety as they walked toward the schoolhouse. "But I would be very disappointed to miss dancing with you at least once." The warmth in his voice dispelled some of her nervousness. "I'll try not to step on your feet too often," she promised with a small smile. "I have complete faith in your natural grace," he replied, his hand briefly touching the small of her back as they entered the transformed schoolroom. What neither of them noticed, in their preoccupation with each other, was Marcus Tillman, watching their entrance with narrowed eyes, a newly arrived stranger at his side, listening intently to whatever he was saying. The schoolhouse had been transformed. Paper lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the room. Desks had been pushed against the walls to create a dance floor, and wildflowers arranged in mason jars decorated every available surface. A small ensemble of local musicians, 2 fiddlers, a banjo player, and an accordion, provided lively music that filled the space. Despite her nervousness, Sarah felt a flutter of excitement as James led her into the room. She'd never attended a proper dance before, and the atmosphere was intoxicating. The music, the laughter, the swirl of color as couples moved across the floor. "Would you like some punch before we dance?" James asked, his hand still warm against her back. Sarah nodded, relieved at the temporary reprieve. As James moved toward the refreshment table, she found herself approached by several of the mothers whose children she'd treated with her remedies. "Miss Mitchell, that salve you made for Betsy's poison ivy worked wonders," Mrs. Thompson said. She stopped scratching almost immediately. "And those digestive drops you gave little Henry, he's keeping his food down now," added Mrs. Foster. "Doc Wilson said to keep using them." Sarah accepted their thanks with modest grace, still somewhat uncomfortable with public recognition. She was explaining the preparation of the poison ivy salve when she became aware of someone standing just behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with a stranger, a tall, well-dressed man with sharp features and calculating eyes. "So, you're the famous Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice cultured but cold. "I've heard quite a lot about you." Something in his manner put Sarah instantly on alert. "I'm afraid you have the advantage, sir. You know my name, but I don't know yours." "Edward Blackwood," he replied with a slight bow. "Recently arrived from Boston. I'm considering investments in this region." Before Sarah could respond, James returned with 2 cups of punch. His easy smile faded slightly when he saw Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood," he acknowledged with a polite nod. "I didn't realize you were acquainted with Miss Mitchell." "We were just introducing ourselves," Blackwood replied smoothly. "I've heard fascinating things about her. Unusual background and remarkable rise in Pine Creek society." There was something in his emphasis that made Sarah uncomfortable, as though he were referencing details she'd rather keep private. "Miss Mitchell has become an invaluable member of our community," James said, handing Sarah her punch. His tone was pleasant but firm, clearly ending the conversation. Blackwood smiled thinly. "So I've gathered. If you'll excuse me, I believe Mr. Tillman is signaling for my attention." As he moved away, Sarah noticed Marcus Tillman indeed waiting across the room, watching their interaction with undisguised interest. "How does he know about my background?" she asked James quietly. "Tillman, most likely," James replied, his expression troubled. "Blackwood arrived 2 days ago and has spent most of his time with Tillman. I don't trust either of them." "What's he doing in Pine Creek?" Sarah wondered, noting the quality of Blackwood's clothes and his air of affluence. "Officially scouting business investments. He's spoken with Mayor Thompson about purchasing land for development." James guided her toward the edge of the dance floor as a waltz began. "But there's something about him that doesn't sit right. With me?" Sarah was inclined to agree, but the thought fled as James set down their cups and turned to her with an expectant smile. "May I have this dance, Miss Mitchell?" Despite her earlier nervousness, Sarah found herself nodding. "You'll need to guide me. I've never waltzed before." "It's simpler than it looks," James assured her, taking her hand and placing his other hand lightly at her waist. "Just follow my lead and count with me. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. They began slowly, off to the side where Sarah's inevitable missteps wouldn't be as noticeable. True to his word, James was an excellent teacher. He guided her patiently, his hand steady at her waist, his movements clear and predictable. "You're a natural," he murmured after a few minutes, when Sarah had progressed from staring at her feet to actually enjoying the rhythm. Most beginners count aloud and look terrified. "I am terrified," Sarah admitted with a small laugh. "I'm just hiding it better than most." As they continued dancing, Sarah became increasingly aware of the intimacy of their position. James held her with respectful distance between them, yet the simple act of moving together in harmony, his hand warm against her waist, created a connection that transcended ordinary conversation. "Thank you," she said softly as the music drew to a close. "For the dance?" James asked, his eyes holding hers. "For everything," Sarah clarified. "The reading lessons, the faith in my abilities this evening, all of it." Something shifted in James's expression, a softening and openness that made Sarah's breath catch. "Sarah, excuse me, Mr. Harrington." The moment was broken by Mayor Thompson's interruption. The portly official nodded politely to Sarah before continuing. "Sorry to disturb your evening, but there's been an accident at the Carter farm. Young Adam fell from the hayloft and broke his arm badly. Mrs. Carter sent their oldest boy to fetch help." James immediately switched from dance partner to community leader. "Has someone gone for Doc Wilson?" "He's delivering the Reynolds baby," the mayor replied grimly. "Won't be available for hours. The boy asked specifically for Miss Mitchell, saying his man remembered how she helped the Wilson boy." Both men turned to Sarah, who was already mentally inventorying her herb supply. "I'll need to stop at the shop for my remedies," she said. "And proper bandaging materials." "I'll drive you," James offered immediately. "My buggy's faster than walking." Within minutes they had left the dance behind. James drove swiftly to Mrs. Harrison's shop, where Sarah gathered her medicinal supplies. Then on to the Carter farm on the outskirts of town. The summer night was warm, stars brilliant in a clear sky that belied the urgency of their mission. "I'm sorry about the dance," James said as they drove. "I know how much courage it took for you to attend. A child's broken arm is more important than my social anxiety," Sarah replied, clutching her herb bag. "Besides, we did get one dance. It was lovely." James glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Yes, it was. The Carter farm was a modest homestead with a small house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Lanterns blazed in the windows, and a crowd of children peered anxiously from the porch as James helped Sarah down from the buggy. Mrs. Carter, a careworn woman with 6 children and another on the way, met them at the door. Thank the Lord you've come, she said, leading them to where Adam, a boy of about 10, lay whimpering on a cot. He climbed up to the hayloft after I told him not to, fell near 15 feet. The boy's right arm was bent at an unnatural angle, already swollen and bruising. Sarah assessed him quickly, noting the cold sweat on his forehead and his rapid breathing. "I'll need hot water, clean clothes, and plenty of light," she told Mrs. Carter, who immediately began organizing her other children to fetch the requested items. "It's a bad break," Sarah told James quietly as they waited. "The bone will need to be reset before I can splint it." "Can I help?" he asked. Sarah nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "Hold him still when I reset the bone. It will be painful, but it must be done quickly and cleanly." When the necessary supplies had been gathered, Sarah prepared a willow bark infusion for pain and applied a numbing poultice to the broken arm. "This will help, but it will still hurt when I reset the bone," she warned Adam, who nodded bravely. Despite his tears, Sarah positioned herself carefully, assessing the angle of the break. "James, hold his shoulders. Mrs. Carter, please hold his other arm and his legs." She looked Adam directly in the eyes. "This will hurt for just a moment, but then the worst will be over. Can you be brave for me?" The boy nodded, his face pale but determined. Sarah took a deep breath, then with swift, sure movements, manipulated the broken bones back into alignment. Adam's scream was heart-wrenching but brief. The pain caused him to faint, which was a blessing for what came next. Working efficiently, Sarah cleaned the area, applied her herbal poultice to reduce swelling, and splinted the arm securely. By the time Adam regained consciousness, the worst was over. "You did wonderfully," she told him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "The bone is back in place and will heal cleanly now." Mrs. Carter was tearfully grateful. "I don't know how to thank you, Miss Mitchell, coming all this way on Independence Day, leaving the celebration." "No thanks necessary," Sarah assured her. "Just keep the splint clean and dry, and make sure Adam drinks the willow bark tea I'm leaving for pain. I'll come check on him in a few days." By the time they left the Carter farm, it was well past midnight. The dance would be over, the town settled into post-celebration silence. James drove at a more leisurely pace for the return journey, both of them tired but satisfied with the evening's work. "You were magnificent," he said, after they had traveled some distance in companionable silence. "Your hands never hesitated, even when faced with such a difficult break." "Experience is a thorough teacher," Sarah replied. "Though I'm still learning, each case is different." "As is each student," James agreed, his tone thoughtful. "Which reminds me of something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Sarah turned to him, curious about his suddenly serious tone. "What is it?" "The Territorial Education Office has authorized funds for an adult literacy program in Pine Creek," he explained. "I applied months ago, before you arrived. The idea is to offer reading and writing lessons to adults who missed formal education in their youth." "That's wonderful," Sarah said sincerely. "Many would benefit from such an opportunity." "Yes, but it would require an additional teacher," James continued. "Someone who understands the unique challenges of adult learning, who has patience and empathy for those discovering literacy later in life." He paused. "I'd like to recommend you for the position." Sarah stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "Me? But I've only just begun reading myself." "Which makes you uniquely qualified," James argued. "You understand the struggles from the inside. You've experienced the frustration and the breakthroughs. Who better to guide others through the same journey?" "But I'm not a teacher," Sarah protested. "I have no training, no certification." "You taught my students more about practical medicine in 3 lessons than I could have in a year," James countered. "Teaching isn't just about credentials, Sarah. It's about connecting with students, helping them discover knowledge for themselves." The car. Buggy pulled up outside Mrs. Harrison's shop, but neither made a move to disembark. In the silvery moonlight, Sarah could see the earnestness in James's expression. "You really believe I could do this?" she said wonderingly. "I know you could." He took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "You've shown remarkable aptitude for learning. Why not extend that gift to others?" Before Sarah could respond, a clattering sound from inside the shop startled them both. A crash followed, then the sound of breaking glass. "Someone's inside," James whispered, immediately alert. "Stay here." But Sarah was already moving, concerned for Mrs. Harrison overriding caution. She might be hurt. They approached the shop door together, finding it ajar, a clear sign of trouble, as Mrs. Harrison was meticulous about locking up each night. James pushed the door open slowly, revealing a scene of disarray inside. Display shelves had been toppled, fabric bolts unrolled across the floor, and the cash box behind the counter lay open and empty. "Mrs. Harrison," Sarah called softly, fear clutching at her heart. A moan from the back room answered her. They rushed to find Mrs. Harrison on the floor of the storage area, a bruise darkening on her temple. "Robbers," she managed weakly, as Sarah knelt beside her. Two men, masked. James immediately checked the rest of the shop while Sarah examined Mrs. Harrison's injury. "No sign of them now," he reported, returning. "They must have fled when they heard us arrive." "It's just a bump," Mrs. Harrison insisted as Sarah helped her to a chair. "But they took everything from the cash box. All our earnings from the celebration sales." "That doesn't matter," Sarah assured her, applying a cold compress to the bruise. "What matters is that you're not seriously hurt." As they tended to Mrs. Harrison and began setting the shop to rights, Sheriff Davis arrived, alerted by a neighbor, who had heard the commotion. "Robbery and assault," the sheriff growled, surveying the damage. "First serious crime we've had in months. Did you get a look at them, Mildred?" Mrs. Harrison shook her head. They wore bandanas over their faces, but one was tall and thin, the other shorter and stockier. And she hesitated. The tall one spoke with an Eastern accent, not local. Sarah and James exchanged a look, both thinking of Edward Blackwood. But without proof, such suspicions were dangerous to voice. The sheriff questioned them further, made notes, and promised to investigate. "We'll check if any other businesses were hit. You three get some rest. I'll send Deputy Miller to keep watch." For the remainder of the night, after he left, Mrs. Harrison insisted she was well enough to return to her own quarters upstairs. "Just a headache, nothing more. You two have done enough for one night." "I'll stay with her," Sarah assured James as he prepared to leave, "and I'll keep watching for any signs of worse injury." At the door, James paused. "About what we were discussing earlier, the teaching position, will you consider it?" "I don't need an answer right away." Despite the tumultuous end to their evening, Sarah found herself smiling. "I'll consider it, though I still think you're overestimating my abilities." "I've never done that," James replied with quiet certainty. "If anything, I suspect you're just beginning to discover the extent of your capabilities." His hand briefly covered, here's where it rested on the doorframe. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, James." As she watched him drive away, Sarah felt a curious mixture of emotions, concern for Mrs. Harrison, lingering adrenaline from the break-in, and underneath it all, a warm glow of possibility sparked by James's unexpected offer. Even the robbery couldn't entirely dim the memory of their dance, of his steadfast support during Adam's treatment, of his unwavering belief in her abilities. The next morning brought unwelcome news. Sheriff Davis arrived early, his expression grim. "We've had reports of 2 more break-ins," he informed them. "The general store and Doc Wilson's office. Same pattern. Cash taken, premises ransacked." "Was anyone hurt?" Sarah asked, thinking. "Of the elderly doctor and his wife, thankfully no. They weren't on the premises." The sheriff's weathered face creased with concern. "But there's something else. Doc's medical bag was stolen, along with his supply of laudanum and other medicines." Mrs. Harrison, moving slowly due to her headache, but insistent on opening the shop, frowned. That's odd. Professional thieves wouldn't bother with medicine when there's money to be had. Unless they have specific plans for it, James suggested, having arrived early to check on them. Laudanum has street value, especially in mining camps. The sheriff nodded. That's our thinking too, but there's more. He hesitated, his gaze shifting to Sarah. Your herb store was specifically targeted, Miss Mitchell. Mrs. Harrison says nothing else is missing from the storage room, but your entire supply of medicinal herbs is gone. Sarah stared at him in dismay. She'd built her collection carefully, over months, gathering local plants and ordering rarer specimens through Mrs. Harrison's suppliers. The loss was not just financial, but practical. Many of her remedies required herbs that would be difficult to replace quickly. Why would anyone steal dried plants? Mrs. Harrison wondered. Most wouldn't know what to do with them, or how to identify which are beneficial and which might be harmful if misused, Sarah added, a chill running through her at the thought. That's what concerns me, the sheriff admitted. Seems like these weren't random targets. The doctor's medicines, your herbs, someone's collecting healing supplies, and I doubt it's for charitable purposes. Throughout the day, as they cleaned up the shop and assessed the damage, Sarah couldn't shake a sense of unease. The theft of her herbs felt personal, targeted, as if someone wanted to undermine her specific contribution to the community. By mid-afternoon, rumors were circulating that connected the robberies to the arrival of strangers in town for the Independence Day celebration. Several people reported suspicious characters at the dance who hadn't been seen before or since. The town council's called an emergency meeting for this evening, James informed Sarah when he stopped by the shop during his lunch break. I think you should attend. Me? Why? Sarah asked, surprised by the suggestion. Because you're one of the victims, and because your medical knowledge might help us understand why someone would target healing supplies specifically. He lowered his voice. And because I suspect Tillman and his new friend Blackwood will be there, possibly with theories of their own about the crimes. The meeting was held in the town hall at 7 that evening. Nearly every adult resident of Pine Creek crowded into the space, voices raised in concerned speculation. Mayor Thompson called for order from his position at the front of the room. Folks, we've had a serious breach of peace in our community, he began. 3 businesses robbed, 1 good citizen assaulted, valuable medicine stolen. Sheriff Davis is investigating, but we need to decide as a community how to respond. What followed was a heated discussion about increased night patrols, whether to hire additional deputies, and how to secure businesses more effectively. Sarah, seated beside James near the middle of the room, listened attentively, but said little. Then Marcus Tillman stood, commanding attention with his imposing presence. Mayor Thompson, I believe we're overlooking an important point. These crimes began immediately after our Independence Day celebration, an event that drew outsiders to Pine. Greek, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Furthermore, Tillman continued, the targets weren't random. They were specifically focused on medical supplies, Doc Wilson's medicines and Miss Mitchell's herbs. The slight hesitation before herbs carried a hint of disdain that wasn't lost on Sarah. What exactly are you suggesting, Tillman? Sheriff Davis demanded. Only that we should consider all possibilities, Tillman replied smoothly, including the possibility that someone in our midst might have connections to these criminals. Several heads turned toward the back of the room, where a group of travelers who had stayed after the celebration were seated. But Sarah noticed that more than a few glances came her way as well. The outsider, the rejected bride, the woman whose mysterious herbal knowledge had been specifically targeted. Edward Blackwood rose next, his cultured voice cutting through the murmurs. If I might offer an observation, Having recently arrived from Boston, I've seen how criminal elements operate in larger cities. They often use advanced scouts, people who gain a community's trust, gather information about valuable targets, then signal to Confederates when and where to strike. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Sarah felt James tense beside her. "That's an outrageous insinuation," he said, standing to face Blackwood directly. "If you have specific accusations to make, Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you make them plainly where they can be properly addressed." Blackwood smiled thinly. "No accusation, Mr. Harrington, merely an observation about criminal methodology. Though I do find it interesting that you're so quick to take offense." Before James could respond, Sarah stood. The movement surprised even her, but she found she could no longer sit silently while suspicion was subtly directed her way. "My herbs were stolen," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Medicines I've used to heal members of this community were taken. I'm a victim of these crimes, not a perpetrator. And I resent the implication that because I am relatively new to Pine Creek, I must somehow be connected to this wrongdoing." Her direct response seemed to catch both Tillman and Blackwood off guard. Several community members nodded in agreement with her words, including Doc Wilson and Mrs. Carter, who had arrived late to the meeting. "Miss Mitchell has proven her value to this town," Doc Wilson declared, standing in support. "Without her knowledge, young Thomas would have lost his leg to infection, and Adam Carter might be crippled now. I won't stand by while her character is questioned based on nothing but timing and her status as a newcomer." The tide of sentiment in the room began to shift, with more voices rising in Sarah's defense. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "Noble sentiments," he said smoothly. "But perhaps we should examine Miss Mitchell's background more carefully before dismissing all concerns. After all, what do we really know about her life before arriving in Pine Creek? About her connections and associations? About the real reason Mr. Tillman found her unsuitable as a bride?" The town hall fell silent at Blackwood's challenge. All eyes turned to Sarah, who stood perfectly still, her face pale but composed. The accusation hung in the air, demanding a response. James started to rise, ready to defend her, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, keeping him seated. This was her battle to fight. "You ask what people know about my background, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. "I'll tell them myself, rather than having it whispered about or used as a weapon against me." She turned to face the assembled townspeople, many of whom had become friends and neighbors over the past months. "I came to Pine Creek as Mr. Tillman's mail-order bride. He rejected me because I couldn't read or write." The simple statement caused a ripple of surprise through the crowd. "I grew up in the mountains of Kentucky with no access to formal schooling. My parents taught me what they could: useful skills, herbal medicine, mathematics enough for household management, but not reading." Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "When Mr. Tillman discovered my illiteracy, he deemed me unsuitable. He had every right to do so. His advertisement specifically requested an educated bride, though I didn't fully understand what that entailed. Mrs. Harrison kindly took me in, gave me work and shelter." Her gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of those she'd helped. "Since then, I've built a life here. I've used my knowledge of herbs and healing to assist Dr. Wilson. I've created quilts and garments that bring business to Mrs. Harrison's shop. And yes, I've been learning to read and write, thanks to Mr. Harrington's patient teaching." Sarah's voice strengthened with conviction. "That is my story, plain and simple. I have no connections to criminals. I have no reason to steal the very medicines I use to help others. If my background makes me suspect in your eyes, then so be it. But judge me on the truth, not on insinuations." A heavy silence followed her words. Then Mrs. Carter stood, pregnant from commanding attention. "Miss Mitchell reset my Adam's arm when he would have been crippled otherwise. she declared. She rode out in the dark to help my boy, leaving a celebration to do it. That's who she is, not whatever Mr. Blackwood is suggesting. Doc Wilson nodded. Emphatically. I've practiced medicine in this territory for 30 years. Miss Mitchell's knowledge of herbal remedies has proven invaluable to my practice. She works alongside me, not in competition. Why would she steal supplies she freely shares? One by one, others rose to speak. Thomas's parents, the mothers whose children Sarah had treated, elderly residents who used her remedies for chronic ailments. Their testimonials created a tapestry of community trust that no insinuation could easily unravel. When they had finished, Sheriff Davis addressed Blackwood directly. Do you have any actual evidence connecting Miss Mitchell to these crimes, Mr. Blackwood, or just speculation based on timing and her status as a newcomer? Blackwood's confident smile faltered slightly. No direct evidence, Sheriff. Merely raising possibilities that should be considered in a thorough investigation. Then I suggest you leave the investigation to me, the sheriff replied firmly. And be careful about casting aspersions on respected members of this community. Without proof, Mayor Thompson, sensing the mood of the room, quickly redirected the meeting toward practical security measures. But the damage to Blackwood's standing was done. People who had been nodding along with his earlier insinuations now regarded him with suspicion. As the meeting concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by supportive townspeople, each offering words of encouragement or simply a friendly pat on the arm. The public revelation of her illiteracy, once her greatest shame, had somehow become a moment of strength rather than humiliation. I'm proud of you, James said quietly when the crowd had dispersed. That took tremendous courage. It felt right, Sarah replied, still somewhat surprised by her own actions. Living with secrets gives others power over you. I'm tired of being afraid of what people might discover. As they stepped outside into the warm summer evening, they found Marcus Tillman waiting, his expression unreadable. Miss Mitchell, he said stiffly. A word, if I may. James tensed protectively, but Sarah nodded. Of course, Mr. Tillman. In private, Tillman specified, glancing at James. After a moment's hesitation, James stepped away, though he remained within sight, his concern evident. You were honest in there, Tillman began, surprising Sarah with his directness. More honest than perhaps was wise, given the circumstances. I've found honesty is usually wiser than the alternatives, Sarah replied carefully. Tillman studied her for a long moment. When you arrived in Pine Creek, I judged you harshly. I expected an educated bride who could assist with my business correspondence. Finding you illiterate seemed a deception. I never claimed to be educated in my letters, Sarah pointed out. Pastor Williams wrote what I dictated, but the omission was mine. I accept responsibility for that. Yes, well. Tillman shifted uncomfortably. What I'm trying to say, poorly perhaps, is that I misjudged you. Not your literacy. That assessment was accurate, but your worth, your intelligence. The admission clearly cost him, and Sarah found herself genuinely touched by the effort. Thank you, Mr. Tillman. That's generous of you to acknowledge. Not generosity, just the truth. He glanced toward where Blackwood stood, conversing with several council members. Be careful of that one, Miss Mitchell. He's not what he seems. Before Sarah could question this cryptic warning, Tillman nodded curtly and walked away. What was that about? James asked, rejoining her. I'm not entirely sure, Sarah admitted. But I think it might have been an apology or a warning, perhaps both. That night, despite her exhaustion, Sarah found sleep elusive. She sat in her small room at Mrs. Harrison's, practicing her writing in the journal James had given her. The events of the day had left her mind too active for rest. A soft knock on her door startled her. Sarah, Mrs. Harrison called quietly. There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Puzzled and somewhat alarmed, Sarah wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened the door to find a young boy, one of the stable hand's sons, looking anxious and out of breath. "Miss Mitchell, you gotta come quick," he blurted. "Mr. Harrington sent me. There's trouble at the schoolhouse." "What kind of trouble?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her boots. "Don't rightly know, ma'am. Just said to fetch you right away. Said it's about them stolen medicines." Sarah's heart raced as she quickly gathered her shawl and followed the boy. The streets of Pine Creek were dark and quiet, most citizens long abed after the excitement of the town meeting. As they approached the schoolhouse, Sarah could see a light burning inside, casting long shadows through the windows. "Wait here," she told the boy at the schoolhouse steps. "If I'm not back out in 5 minutes, run for Sheriff Davis." The child nodded solemnly, clearly taking his responsibility seriously. Sarah entered cautiously, immediately spotting James at his desk, head bent over papers. He looked up at her entrance, confusion crossing his features. "Sarah, what are you doing here at this hour?" A cold realization washed over her. "You didn't send for me?" "No." Before he could continue, the schoolhouse door slammed shut behind her. Sarah whirled to find Edward Blackwood standing there, a revolver held casually in his hand. "How convenient," he drawled. "Both of you in one place. Saves me the trouble of collecting Mr. Harrington separately." James rose slowly, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah. "What's the meaning of this, Blackwood?" "Insurance," Blackwood replied calmly. "My business in Pine Creek is concluding, but I need certain guarantees against interference." He gestured with the revolver. "Both of you, sit down, hands where I can see them." As they complied, Sarah's mind raced. The stable boy would run for the sheriff if she didn't return, but that would take time. They needed to stall. "The robberies," she said, understanding Dawn. "That was you." Blackwood smiled coldly. "Not personally. I don't dirty my hands with such tasks. But yes, under my direction." "Why?" James demanded. "What possible value could Doc Wilson's medicines and Sarah's herbs?" "After you? Considerable value, in fact." Blackwood perched on the edge of a student desk, keeping the revolver trained on them. "There's a cholera outbreak in the mining camps north of here. Quarantine has been established. No doctors allowed in or out. Limited medical supplies reaching the miners. So you're stealing medicines to sell to desperate people at inflated prices," James concluded, disgust evident in his voice. "Business opportunity," Blackwood corrected. "Simple supply and demand. Those herbs of yours," he nodded toward Sarah, "properly packaged and presented as miracle cures, will fetch handsome prices from men dying of cholera." The callousness of his plan horrified Sarah. Most of those herbs won't help cholera victims. Some might actually harm them if improperly prepared. "Details that needn't concern the buyer," Blackwood shrugged. "Perception of value is what matters in business." "It's not business, it's murder," Sarah countered, "selling false hope to dying men and preventing real medicines from reaching them." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Your moral objections are noted, Miss Mitchell, but irrelevant. Now, to business. I'll be departing Pine Creek before dawn. You two will remain secured here until my associates and I are well away. After that, someone will notify the sheriff of your location." "And if we refuse to cooperate?" James asked quietly. "Then the sheriff will find bodies rather than hostages," Blackwood replied matter-of-factly. "I prefer to avoid violence. Messy, attracts attention, but I'm not sentimental about it." As Blackwood reached into his pocket, presumably for rope to bind them, Sarah caught a movement at the window behind him, a small face peering in. The stable boy had disobeyed her instructions to run for help, instead watching the confrontation. Himself. She needed to keep Blackwood talking, to give the child time to fetch assistance. "How did you know about my herbs?" she asked. "About their medicinal properties?" Blackwood smirked. "Tillman was quite informative about your background as a mountain healer. Once I expressed interest in local investment opportunities, he was eager to share all manner of town gossip." He withdrew a length of rope from his pocket, particularly about the mail-order bride he rejected, who'd somehow ingratiate herself with the town schoolmaster. "Tillman helped you plan the robberies?" James asked, his tone suggesting he found this difficult to believe, despite his dislike of the man. "Not knowingly," Blackwood clarified. "He merely provided information. Like many small-minded men, he enjoys feeling important to those with greater vision and resources. Now, Miss Mitchell, your hands, please." Before Sarah could comply, a crash sounded from outside, breaking glass followed by shouting. Blackwood turned toward the noise, momentarily distracted. James seized the opportunity, lunging forward to tackle him. The revolver discharged as they struggled, the bullet splintering wood near Sarah's head. She scrambled to help, grabbing a heavy bookend from the desk and striking Blackwood's wrist. The revolver clattered to the floor, sliding under a row of desks. Blackwood fought with surprising strength for a businessman, landing a solid blow to James's jaw that sent him staggering. The schoolhouse door burst open, revealing Sheriff Davis with his deputy, both armed and ready. Behind them stood the stable boy, wide-eyed but proud of his role in the rescue. "Drop your weapon, Blackwood," the sheriff commanded. "Too late," James informed him, wiping blood from his split lip. "The weapon's already been dropped, thanks to Miss Mitchell's quick thinking." Blackwood, seeing himself outnumbered and outmaneuvered, raised his hands in surrender. "A misunderstanding, Sheriff. I was merely having a private conversation with Mr. Harrington and Miss Mitchell." At gunpoint, after midnight. The sheriff's skepticism was evident as his deputy moved to secure Blackwood. A strange way to converse. As Blackwood was handcuffed and led away, Sarah turned to James, examining his injured jaw with gentle fingers. "You should put a cold compress on this to reduce the swelling." James captured her hand in his, holding it against his face. "I was terrified he would harm you," he admitted quietly. "I was worried for you as well," Sarah replied. "It seems we've developed a habit of protecting each other." The sheriff returned after securing Blackwood in the jail. "You two all right? Need the doctor take a look at that jaw, Harrington?" James shook his head. "I'm in capable hands, Sheriff, but you should know. Blackwood confessed to orchestrating the robberies. He's planning to sell stolen medicines to quarantined mining camps experiencing a cholera outbreak. That matches what we found in his room at the hotel," the sheriff confirmed. "Crates of medicines and herbs, already packaged with fancy labels claiming to cure everything from cholera to consumption." He turned to Sarah. "Thanks to this young lady's knowledge, we can get the real medicines back to Doc Wilson and prevent Blackwood from harming those miners with false cures." After giving their statements and ensuring the stable boy was safely returned home with a silver dollar for his bravery, James insisted on walking Sarah back to Mrs. Harrison's shop. "Quite an eventful evening," he commented as they walked through the quiet streets. "Not how I expected the day to end after the town meeting." "Life rarely follows our expectations," Sarah replied. "I certainly never expected to find myself in Pine Creek at all, much less facing down an armed medicine thief in the schoolhouse." James chuckled, then winced as the movement aggravated his bruised jaw. "Speaking of expectations, I never received your answer about the teaching position. Though after tonight's excitement, I understand if you need more time to consider." Sarah stopped walking, turning to face him directly in the moonlight. "I don't need more time. I want to accept the position if you still think I'm qualified." "Qualified?" James's expression softened. "Sarah, you're the most qualified person I can imagine. You understand the struggles of adult learners because you've lived them. You have patience, intelligence, and a gift for explaining complex ideas simply. The real question is whether the position is worthy of you." His words warmed her more deeply than any praise she'd ever received. "Thank you for seeing value in me when others didn't." "I saw what was always there," James replied. just as you saw in me something beyond the town schoolmaster." He took her hands in his expression growing serious. "Sarah, these past months have been the most meaningful of my life. Teaching you, learning from you, facing challenges together, it's created a bond I've never experienced before." Sarah's heart quickened. "For me as well," she admitted softly. "Then, perhaps," James continued, his voice gentle but certain, "we might consider making that bond permanent." Though not phrased as a direct question, his meaning was unmistakable. Sarah found herself momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was suggesting. "James, are you certain?" "I'm still learning to read, still finding my place." "Here, I've never been more certain of anything," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your journey is part of what I admire most about you. Your courage in facing challenges, your determination to grow, your willingness to share your unique knowledge. I don't want a finished portrait, Sarah. I want a partner in painting the future." The poetry of his words brought tears to her eyes. "Then yes," she whispered, "I would be honored to build that future with you." James's smile illuminated his face, transforming it with joy. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he leaned forward and kissed her. Their first kiss, tender and sweet, a promise of the life they would build together. The months that followed brought dramatic changes to Pine Creek and to Sarah's life. Edward Blackwood was tried and convicted for the robberies and for attempted kidnapping. His stolen medicines were returned to Doc Wilson and supplemented with Sarah's herbal remedies, then sent to the mining camps, properly labeled with accurate instructions for use. Marcus Tillman, though not criminally involved in Blackwood's scheme, was chastened by his role in providing information that enabled it. He made a public apology to Sarah at a town council meeting, acknowledging that his wounded pride had clouded his judgment about her character and abilities. The adult literacy program began in September, with classes held 3 evenings a week in the schoolhouse. Sarah's first students included Mrs. Coleman, the elderly seamstress who had always relied on her daughter to read patterns, Mr. Jenkins, the blacksmith who wanted to read contracts before signing them, and to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Carter, who admitted she'd been hiding her own illiteracy for 20 years. Sarah approached teaching with the same patience and insight James had shown her, adapting methods to each student's needs and strengths. Her own reading and writing continued to improve rapidly, fueled now by the dual motivations of her teaching responsibilities and the letters James wrote her nearly every day. Simple notes at first, growing more complex as her skills advanced. Their wedding took place on a crisp October afternoon, with the entire town in attendance. Sarah wore a dress she'd made herself, ivory cotton with delicate embroidery she'd designed based on the wildflowers of both Wyoming and Kentucky. Mrs. Harrison stood beside her as matron of honor, and Doc Wilson, who had become a close friend and medical mentor, gave her away. The ceremony was traditional, but with one significant deviation. When it came time for Sarah to speak her vows, she did not repeat after the minister, but instead produced a small piece of paper from her sleeve. In a clear, steady voice, she read the words she had written herself. Her first complete composition, a testament to both her progress as a reader and the depth of her feelings for James. "I came to Pine Creek seeking a home and found a partner instead. I arrived unable to read words, but knowing how to read hearts and healing plants. You saw value where others saw limitations. You offered knowledge without condescension, strength without domination, love without condition. Today I promise to continue learning alongside you from books, from nature, from challenges, and from joy. This is my vow, written by my hand and sealed with my heart." There wasn't a dry eye in the church when she finished, least of all James's. His responding vows were equally moving, promising to honor both her growing literacy and her native wisdom. to be her most devoted student as well as her husband. As winter settled over Pine Creek, Sarah and James established their home in the small cabin he had previously occupied alone. They expanded it room by room as their needs grew, adding a dedicated space for Sarah's expanding herbal practice and eventually a nursery for the children they hoped would come. Sarah's reputation as both healer and teacher spread beyond Pine Creek. Neighboring communities began sending students to her literacy classes, and Doc Wilson formally took her on as an apprentice, legitimizing the medical knowledge she had carried from the mountains of Kentucky to the plains of Wyoming. The journal James had given her became the first of many. She filled them with herbal remedies, teaching observations and personal reflections, creating written records of knowledge that had previously existed only in her memory, ensuring it would survive beyond her lifetime. One evening, as the first snow of December frosted the windows of their cabin, James found Sarah at her desk, writing by lamplight. "Another journal entry?" he asked, setting a cup of tea beside her. Sarah smiled up at him. "A letter, actually, to a young woman in Boston who advertised in the territorial newspaper seeking teaching opportunities out west. I thought she might be suited for the new school in Riverdale." James raised an eyebrow, taking on the role of matchmaker. "In a sense," Sarah admitted, "though not for marriage, for purpose." She looked down at the nearly filled page, her handwriting now neat and confident. "Everyone deserves the chance to contribute their gifts, to be valued for their true capabilities rather than judged by their limitations." James leaned down to kiss her forehead. "You've certainly proven that. From rejected bride to respected teacher and healer in less than a year." Sarah set down her pen and rose to embrace him. "The rejection was the greatest gift I could have received," she said softly. "It led me to freedom, to purpose, to you." As they stood together in the warm glow of the lamp, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled west seeking a husband who would accept her despite her illiteracy, only to find a man who helped her overcome it while valuing the knowledge she already possessed. The ability to read words had opened new worlds to her, but James had taught her to read something far more valuable: her own worth, written not in letters, but in the unique gifts she brought to the world. And that, Sarah knew, was a lesson worth sharing with others, through teaching, through healing, and through the love that had transformed a mail-order mistake into a life richer than she could have imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.